you for being here. I know it's been a long day. So my talk will just be on how the CIA fostered the synthetic left. And generally, there have been two approaches taken to defeating communism, or trying to defeat communism, and they've worked in tandem. One faction of the ruling class has taken the approach of tightening things up, right? We think of the military-industrial complex. We think of the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1950, which was the secret plan in a case of emergency to detain millions of communists and other political dissidents in concentration camps. And, an authoritarian society with a fascist military state, lots of military spending, crush the labor movement, etc. But there's another faction coming from the CIA and the intelligence apparatus that's taken a different approach. Instead of tightening up, let's create lots of chaos. Loosen up society, ensure no solid leftist organization can be formed amid the chaos, and spread this chaos into communist and anti-imperialist countries so as to tear them down. It is this latter approach that will be the focus of today's talk. But again, these two approaches are working together in tandem. So Caleb got the question when he traveled internationally, what's wrong with American communists, right? What has gone wrong? Why aren't you guys more serious? So it's it's worth reflecting on how strong the American anti-imperialist left once was. At the height of McCarthyism, prominent American artists, musicians, and intellectuals like Shostakovich, Aaron Copland, the scientist, the physicist Robert Oppenheimer, Albert Einstein, and others came together to show solidarity with the Soviet Union and to condemn American imperialism. And you can see the symbol, that should look familiar, right? Out front protesting the conference were Irving Kristol and his group of middle-class New York City intellectuals. Please boo. Thank you. Thank you. Kristol, as we know, a former Trotskyist who had come to despise the working class during his time serving in the military. And he said, I want nothing to do with the working class, right? The recently formed CIA was very dismayed by the strength of the pro-Soviet American left and were determined to weaken the movement. That same year, NATO was founded, 1949, to contain and roll back communism. The CIA pursued soft power tactics, hiring Irving Kristol to head the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So we had some CIA cutout magazines. Following World War II, the CIA and other United States agencies, as we know, hired many Nazis and anti-communist spies and informants to help with the Cold War. We know about Operation Paperclip, Operation Gladio, but it waged an ideological soft power campaign for control over the left information space and discourse in academia and in popular culture. A number of magazines were also covertly funded by the CIA. Partisan Review, the Paris Review, Encounter in London, Der Monat in Germany. The Partisan Review was everywhere, kind of like Epic Times, right? You can get it for free wherever you want. Contributors included Hannah Arendt, Susan Sontag, Mary McCarthy, Irving Howe, who went on to form the DSA, Gloria Steinem, second wave feminist, founder of New York Magazine in the 1960s, and who bragged about her collaboration with the CIA. These were leftist socialist magazines that critiqued U.S. society, so they resonated on some level, and they critiqued American capitalism, but they also demonized and attacked anyone who was supportive of the Soviet Union. Lillian Hellman, who in 1934 had written the first ever Broadway play about the LGBT rights called The Children's Hour. Hellman called herself an unrepentant Stalinist and was very proud of her work in support of the Soviet Union. So Mary McCarthy of Partisan Review launched an all-out attack to cancel the elderly Hellman and destroy her reputation. All over the newspapers, she was labeled for getting some small details wrong. But ultimately, Hellman successfully sued Mary McCarthy for having the temerity to say on national television that every word Hellman writes is a lie, including and the. So she deserved that. Vanessa Redgrave, unrepentant anti-Zionist. According to a 2018 Times of Israel article, Redgrave is unapologetic for referring to Zionist hoodlums during her Academy Awards acceptance speech 40 years ago. Redgrave was referring to her remarks at the 1978 Oscars to members of the Jewish Defense League who were objecting to her funding and narrating a documentary called The Palestinian, a 1977 documentary she made about the Palestinian situation and the activities of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. She received Best Supporting Actress Oscar for her performance in the 1977 film Julia, in which she played the title role, a woman murdered by Nazis prior to World War II for her anti-fascist activism. And so during Vanessa Redgrave's nomination, she received the in which, following her nomination, members of the JDL burned her in effigy and allegedly offered a bounty on her head. There was a firebombing at one of the theaters that screened the documentary. The JDL also picketed the Academy Awards ceremony where she received her Oscar opposite pro-PLO demonstrators. And she was defiant. She was defiant in her support for Palestinians. Let's talk about the new left and left-wing anti-communism. Here we have a nice picture of Hannah Arendt with a cigarette. These CIA-funded publications like Partisan Review sowed ideological confusion on the left about the nature of communism and fascism. These anti-communist efforts accelerated after Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956 attacking Stalin, and that was demoralizing, and that's when we saw the trot groups take off, right? But we also saw many people quit. Hannah Arendt argued that both communism and fascism were totalitarian. She wrote in 1958, "The totalitarian movements aim at and succeed in organizing masses, not classes." The conclusion from Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem is basically a repudiation of working people, that we need free thinkers and intellectuals because the broad masses of people are deep down a bunch of Nazis, basically. And here we see this conflation of Hitler and Stalin. Both Hitler and Stalin held out promises of stability in order to hide their intention of creating a state of permanent instability. As Marxists and scientific socialists, we understand that fascism is, we have the historical material understanding of fascism, that fascism is the mass mobilization of destruction and driving down of living conditions intended to resolve an economic crisis that is produced by capitalism as a means of trying to save capitalism. However, Susan Sontag redefined fascism as an aesthetic, as basically groups of people coming together, assembling, organizing in groups, doing gymnastics. By this redefinition, mass mobilization towards socialism is also somehow fascism. Of course, we know that revolutions are in fact made by the broad masses of people, not by a sliver of middle-class intellectuals. Indeed, Sontag called communism fascism with a human face, decades before Vosh went live. Here we have a quote. Would anyone like to read this quote? Please.
Communism is fascism, successful fascism, if you will. What we have called fascism is rather the form of tyranny that can be overthrown, that has largely failed. I repeat, not only is fascism an overt military rule, the probable destiny of all communist societies, especially when their population are moved to revolt, but communism is, in itself, a variant, the most successful variant of fascism. Fascism with a human face. I believe this was at a rally condemning Poland.
The anti-Semitic labor. Rally to support actual fascists.
The synthetic leftist Angela Davis instead of recognizing racism as a tool for the capitalists, suggested it was reductionist to privilege a class-based analysis of oppression over any other oppression, right? And the idea that this idea of class reductionism to focus on class over, say, gender or race or something else, right? And she came from the, of course, studied at the Frankfurt School. Here we have Jane Fonda in Vietnam. She won the Notemaker Hanoi Jane. Yeah. And you can see, she got a lot of flack for this, for doing this. And you can think of how this was reappropriated later with Angelina Jolie in Ukraine, right? And all of these people. So using this aesthetic to support the people against the brutal occupiers, right? Here's Vanessa Redgrave, who did the Palestinian documentary, was a fan of Gaddafi. So let's give Vanessa Redgrave a round of applause.
Paid for her documentary, I believe. He funded it.
Wow.
And it was screened all over the Middle East to support.
And here she is, defiantly standing up against the Zionist. There's Lillian Hellman, the unrepentant Stalinist. Yeah. And wrote the first LGBT play on Broadway, at least, the first play about two women. Hippie drugs fests. Let's talk about MK Ultra. So Alan Dulles purchased over 1 million doses of LSD and flooded the streets of the United States. In 1955, the CIA began part of MK Ultra called Operation Midnight Climax, in which prostitutes would bring someone back to the room. They would be given LSD secretly. They did not know they were ingesting it. The room had two-way mirrors, allowing CIA agents to observe the pair throughout the night. And they were trying to see if LSD mixed with sex was a viable means of getting someone to give up sensitive information. And they found that people were prone to give up secrets immediately after sex, even without LSD. So, UCLA, there you go. UCLA professor Dr. Timothy Leary was introduced to LSD by Sidney Gottlieb, the head of CIA's head of the MK Ultra mind control project. In 1966, Leary popularized the slogan, "Turn on, tune in, drop out," in a counterculture era phase. The CIA wanted people to drop out of the growing anti-war movement to focus on, finding themselves as individuals, negotiating meaning through a postmodern lens, and basically indulging themselves in becoming hedonists. To counter the influence of powerful art abroad, for example, the movement of socialist realism that promoted worker solidarity and Marxism, and also to undermine the legacy of social realism in the U.S., Diego Rivera murals, etc. The CIA promulgated Norman Rockwell. We all know Norman Rockwell, right? But also boosted the abstract expressionism of Jackson Pollock and the work of left pessimist beat poets like Allen Ginsberg. A short clip from a great YouTube channel that everyone should be subscribed to, Ramiro Sebastian Funes. Yeah. And I'm going to let this man speak for himself. He's interviewing someone named John Potash about the roots of the Project MK Ultra. So let's go ahead and watch.
I remember around Occupy, that was actually around the time that I became radicalized and began learning about socialism and anti-imperialism. And I went to an Occupy rally one time in Zuccotti Park in New York. I'm originally from New York. And there was this weird guy. He seemed like a cop or a Fed or something. And he was going around asking people, he was like, "Do you guys want to trip out? Do you guys want to get some tabs?" Like, he just kept promoting that over and over. And it just felt so unauthentic. It felt so staged. And I was very suspicious of that. One thing that, going back to some of the early history that I find really fascinating, and thank you for making the connection between the U.S. and the Nazi scientists who were brought under paperclip. One thing that I find really fascinating is that in the 60s, you have in 1967, The Summer of Love, where they have the human being in San Francisco. You mentioned it in your book, which I thought was fascinating. And then 1969, The Summer of Love. I find it interesting that, 1969 Woodstock. And I find it interesting that at all these events, there just miraculously happen to be all these tabs of acid being passed out. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about who the role of Timothy Leary, because you write about him quite a bit in the book, the role of the universities in promoting this. I believe Stanford, I'm not sure which university, Columbia University, how they use these mass events like Woodstock, the Summer of Love, and how the hippie movement at that time was in a way used as astroturf against revolutionary movements. Because again, the context, right? We have the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, the Brown Berets. We have all these revolutionary groups defending the Vietnamese Revolution. How was this hippie movement and LSD? What role did those play in the 60s and into the 70s?
Yeah, well, it's a lot to cover, but with Timothy Leary, I quote two sources that talk about him admitting in an interview that he was a knowing, agent of the CIA, at least since 1963. He said he knew he was, doing the work of the CIA. And so first he got the CIA grants before 1963, and then from 63 on, he was knowingly doing the CIA's bidding, he said. And so he basically, there was many professors like him that were just, giving acid and, first psychedelic mushrooms and acid to students to see how it would affect them. But in what they were doing, besides that, was promoting acid, inadvertently promoting acid to students around the country. Now, Timothy Leary then, in saying he knowingly was working for the CIA from 1963 on, about 1963, he was actually kicked out of Harvard. Him and his two colleagues, professors at Harvard, were kicked out. They then joined forces with these William Mellon Hitchcock and his sister Peggy Mellon Hitchcock. Now, the Mellon Hitchcock family was one of the wealthiest families in the country, if not the world. The Mellons owned Mellon Bank and Carnegie Mellon University, and the Hitchcocks owned Gulf Oil, and so they were extremely wealthy. They also, from that family came some high-level U.S. intelligence officers, and so it was obvious what was going on when they joined forces with Leary to start a international psychedelic group, and it was called something like the International Foundation for Internal Freedom, if ridiculous name. But, they had a lot of ridiculous names amongst what they were doing. So here he was promoting acid, and the media, of course, is shared its boards of directors. That's a wild picture of him. But the media shared boards of directors with the defense contractors, the pharmaceutical companies, the banks, all the wealthiest multinational corporations. So, and it came out in the 1970s when they were uncovering all this stuff about MK Ultra when the Senate Church Committee uncovered a lot of this. They also found out that well over 400 members of the media were leading dual lives in their work for the CIA, and so. Wow. Yeah, and so Watergate muckraker Carl Bernstein wrote an article about that he could only publish in Rolling Stone magazine, which was just an upstart new magazine at the time. And so no one else would publish him despite all his fame from Watergate and, uncovering Richard Nixon's role in Watergate and Nixon getting, resigning. They did a movie based on, Woodward and Bernstein, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward and all that. But so even though he was incredible, one of the most famous journalists in the world at that time, he could only get this article published in Rolling Stone magazine. But that article that outlined how this U.S. Senate Church Committee found that basically all the owners of all the major media in our country at that time in the 70s were leading dual lives in their work for the CIA. And most of their editors, and key journalists who would plant stories for the CIA, And so, it was obvious that they would promote Timothy Leary and that agenda that make it look like Timothy Leary was all about peace, love, and great things, when he was really about hurting people's minds with acid. And he knew it. And MK Ultra scientists and him and others, they knew it hurt people's minds. But at the same time, they'd already damaged Leary's mind enough that they could just manipulate him and control him. While at the same time, he knew he was doing their bidding. He didn't have enough intellectual power to even fight it, or even he was scared to fight it. But he was doing their bidding for sure.
Let's talk about Zbigniew Brzezinski and the pivot to soft power. So Brzezinski was the main Cold War strategist after the U.S. was defeated in Vietnam. He and Kissinger established the Trilateral Commission, a think tank funded by the Rockefeller family. And his quote here, "The three grand imperatives of imperial geostrategy are to prevent collusion and maintain security dependence among the vassals, to keep tributaries pliant and protected, and to keep the barbarians from coming together, or keep them killing each other." So instead of bombs and soldiers, Brzezinski relied on proxy forces to exploit divisions among communists. He borrowed the same approach of counter gangs used by the British intelligence officer Frank Kitson to defeat Kenyan resistance in the 1950s with the so-called Mau Mau liberation fighters, who are in fact backed by the British Empire. Brzezinski financed and armed self-proclaimed communists such as the ultra-leftist Pol Pot in Vietnam, mass murderer and cannibal Jonas Savimbi and his UNITA in Angola, who was, again, a cannibal, and Eritrean separatists to fight the pro-Soviet Derg government in Ethiopia, among others. So he used soft power methods to give the USSR its own Vietnam, quote unquote, with the Afghan trap. Like Lily was saying earlier, the origin of the term tanky as a pejorative to describe defenders of the Soviet Union and other actually existing Soviet countries came from Western journalists focusing their cameras on the one Soviet tank in Kabul. They sought to portray the Soviet Union as this cold, mechanical, neo-colonial killing machine, and that may sound familiar. In Afghanistan, there was also a whole public relations campaign that co-opted left-wing aesthetics to try to make Osama bin Laden and al-Zarqawi look like Che Guevara. There was even a 1989 James Bond movie, The Living Daylights, that was dedicated to the Mujahideen of Afghanistan, heroically fighting the Soviets. We've got the National Endowment for Democracy. A lot of, as Alan Weinstein said, the NED co-founder in 1991, he said, a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. So the NED funds news organizations, NGOs, trains opposition journalists in protest tactics, social media, and sowing internal discord, fomenting color revolution. Again, it's always working in tandem. So while the U.S. continues its hard power tactics, like blockades and proxy wars, it also relies on soft power from entities like the Peace Corps, for example, with benevolent-sounding mission statements and a progressive veneer. Internationally, it's sought to destabilize countries from within by invading their information space, violating their information sovereignty, flooding social media with regime change propaganda, as we saw in Cuba with Instagram in the failed color revolution there recently, and documenting any reaction to these efforts as supposed crackdowns on freedom of the press and so-called open society, as Karl Popper said. For example, in Ecuador, the NED boosted Jaco Perez. As he was an Ecuadorian politician and indigenous rights and human rights activist, right? And this Jaco Perez, this basically NGO-socialist, fake socialist, was, called any movement. He condemned the left-wing economist Arouse and the citizen revolution movement. And he also condemned any efforts to harness and nationalize the country's resources for the people as extractivists. So again, using this greenwashing this imperialism and calling it extractivist to use your resources for the people, right? So since the unpopular war in Vietnam, the U.S. has had to justify its wars of aggression as necessary humanitarian interventions. Think of the R2P doctrine, right to protect doctrine, Samantha Power, peacekeeping missions, etc. We're bringing stability and democracy. Of course, the results are consistently the opposite. Iraq and Afghanistan were reminders that it's more politically expedient to have other countries' young people fight its wars, like Ukrainians, for example. Here we've got the CIA, creating a safe space at the CIA. No Place for Hate, right? At Raytheon. BreadTube Serves Imperialism. Great book, if you haven't read it. I know the author. So BreadTube is an unofficial counter gang of the CIA that draws on Trotskyism, anarchism, and social democracy to redefine both socialism and fascism. Young people, over-socialized to follow and like or ratio and block, are increasingly unaccustomed to healthy dissent, argument, and debate. We have some characters like Natalie ContraPoints Win, or as Isha from Historically quipped, Contras. Self-described libertarian socialist Ian Kaczynski, aka Jabba the Vosh. Thank you. Pessimist and doomer Thought Slime. And video gamer Stephen Destiny Bennell, who all have their own vendetta against actually existing socialism. Some have had consultations with this strange character, Dr. Steve Hassan, a former Mooney cult member, who after the events, the most important event in world history, January 6th, called for a mass deprogramming of Trump supporters. BreadTube perpetuates the lie of the 20th century that in no country has socialism ever worked. It portrays Stalin and Mao as mass-murdering dictators. Real socialism is rebranded as workers' cooperative, stock options, that kind of thing. Raising the property question is considered class reductionist. BreadTube vilifies AES countries as authoritarian, anti-democratic, fascist, deserving of sanctions, and in need of regime change. In December 2021, the Grey Zone's Kit Clarenberg exposed a British state-sponsored PSYOPs by Amilcon's Valiant Projects, which was a social change communications firm that gave PR boosts to jihadists in Syria. Valiant Projects was using the BreadTuber Abigail Thorne for its operation. So again, just validating the thesis of BreadTube by showing this link. So thank you, Grey Zone. There's the article on the Grey Zone. Beyond YouTube, revered middle-class intellectuals in academia, like the late historian Robert Conquest at Stanford, Timothy Snyder at Yale, and Stephen Kotkin at Princeton, all senior fellows at the Hoover Institution, have engaged in fraudulent research and scholarship so as to help construct and maintain what an anti-communist and what Grover Furr calls the anti-Stalinist paradigm in the field of Russian studies. So again, we have culture and then also academia and educational institutions. Here we've got some fine organizations. Coda Story, if you're not familiar. We've got the Hipster Imperialists, Vice. We've got Media Matters. We've got National Petroleum Radio. The Intercept, they like to burn sources. We've got Bellingcat and Jacobin. We've got MSNBC, Voice of America, and Radio Free Asia. Among others, right?
Where's CNN?
Oh yeah, CNN's on there. Exactly. Oh, I see all perspectives. I see Fox News, MSNBC, and CNN. So I got it covered. That's the Overton window, right? Oh, here we have this Twitter. Twitter had a new policy where a disinformation, quote unquote, policy about what was it? Undermining confidence in NATO, something crazy like that. And then we've got this. Yeah, exactly. And then we've got NewsGuard, which Bill Gates has been pushing as a way to basically handpick sources that are credible for young people and I'll get into that in a minute. I'm going to practice my Spanish here. La próxima guerra en Europa será entre Rusia y el fascismo, solo que el fascismo se llamará democracia. And the next war in Europe will be between Russia and fascism, only fascism will be called democracy. And he said that in 1992. The official narrative promulgated by our state media, for example, by Mika Brzezinski on MSNBC, is that Ukraine is a sovereign democracy warding off an invading aggressor in the form of Putin, who we are to believe is the reincarnation of Hitler. That Russia has committed war crimes against civilians, that it is the one blocking the ports from delivering food and stealing Ukrainian grain. Despite this slicker than ever media blitz to convince Americans that we must stand with Ukraine at any cost, it is clear from polls that the media is losing control of its narrative as the realities of its economic war set in. On June 10th, 2022, Biden said that Putin's price hike is hitting Americans hard, but recent polling suggests that few Americans buy this. Only about 11% think Putin has to do with the gas price. And the result of this loss of narrative control has been a desperate bid to use the powers of the state and big tech to silence dissenting voices. There's been a ramping up of unprecedented censorship in the West since February 2022, with RT losing its broadcast license in the UK and Europe, and also having to shutter RT America. Boo. There was also for a brief time Nina Jankowicz's Orwellian Disinformation Governance Board to protect our democracy by fighting disinformation. Dylan Burns gets some exclusive access there. That's not glowy. As part of this information war, new policies on Twitter, YouTube, and other major platforms have now have policies prohibiting contradiction of the official narrative, deleting content and pulling channels, banning journalists. Veteran journalist Pepe Escobar, geopolitical analyst and journalist Brian Berletic of the New Atlas, and former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter were permanently banned from Twitter. After an inquiry from a journalist with the Financial Times, Haas of Infrared, and Jackson Hinkle were thrown off Twitch for supposedly spreading disinformation, or as we'd call it, spreading information. Just as WikiLeaks was financially attacked back in 2010, and more recently the Canadian truckers had their assets frozen, Caleb Maupin, Consortium News, Alan McLeod, Minpress News, and other journalists were summarily banned from PayPal. Anti-imperialist YouTuber Jackson Hinkle was also banned from PayPal and Venmo. 28-year-old German-speaking blogger Alina Lipp, who has reported from the Donbass during this conflict, she's a German-Russian blogger. She's been attacked for making Putin's war propaganda on her Telegram channel, which you should all subscribe to. It's called News from Russia, but it's in German. Now the German government is investigating Lipp under Section 140 of the Criminal Code for, quote-unquote, rewarding and approving of crimes, and has seized 12,000 euros from her German donation accounts. Then there are the death threats. The Ukrainian government has an official kill list, Enemies of Ukraine database, called Mirochevets, I'm butchering that, I'm sure, or Peacekeeper website, that includes the Canadian independent journalist Eva K. Bartlett, another person you should subscribe to on YouTube, does amazing work. The Canadian mainstream media has expressed strong condemnation, not at this war crime, not at this threat towards the journalists, but has directed their condemnation at Eva K. Barrett herself for supposedly siding with Putin. Aaron Mate was smeared by The Guardian recently. Got some totally not propaganda. All right, let's talk about Paul Mason, anti-fascist Paul Mason. Masongate, and I'm wrapping up. Masongate, so on June 8th, 2022, journalist Wyatt Reed was banned from PayPal after his first ever criticism of Paul Mason, who's an English celebrity journalist, Trotskyist, synthetic leftist, and member of the transatlantic elite, who had been exposed for conspiring a multi-pronged attack to deplatform and create a permanent rebuttal operation against the Gray Zone and similar outlets. The Gray Zone, by the way, just beat a frivolous slap lawsuit. It's worth mentioning that a conversation with between Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate regarding Paul Mason was the first ever video from the gray zone that was pulled off of YouTube, reinstated, and then pulled off again. Not sketchy at all. So I'd like to show a very short clip. One of my favorites, Max Blumenthal. Let's give Max a listen.
So Paul Mason is probably one of the best known journalists in the UK and the most famous left-wing journalist in the UK. I mean, he has positioned himself as a man. Yeah. Well, sure. He's positioned himself as a left-wing journalist. He was the go-to person when Greece had its uprising against the austerity imposed upon it. He even positioned himself as an ally of Palestine. I met him briefly at a People's Tribunal in Brussels on Israel's assault on Gaza. He then positioned himself as unofficial media spokesman for Jeremy Corbyn when he was Labour leader. Behind the scenes, he was actually kind of conniving against Corbyn. But the media in the UK decided that Paul Mason had his finger on the pulse of the British grassroots left. Now, those of us who've been around the British grassroots left or even the US left knew another side of Mason, that he was actually kind of a neocon type, which isn't surprising given his Trotskyist background, that he comes from Trotskyist circles in the 80s. He's really invested in regime change programs. He has become increasingly militaristic in recent years. And as conflict in Ukraine broke out and erupted into full-scale war in late February, Mason first led what he called a UK left delegation to Ukraine, and then returned and led a series of trade union rallies for military intervention in Ukraine. And it looked as though a bunch of NATO staff had gotten out in the street to impersonate leftists and unionists. It was a bizarre event. Michael Tracy kind of exposed as such. So like, Mason was trying to lead the left-wing chorus for World War III. And in the process, he became obsessed with anyone and everyone on the left in the UK and the US, and mainly on Twitter, who was making noise in the opposite direction, who was criticizing massive arms shipments to Ukraine. So that would mean Aaron Mate got on his radar. I got on his radar. So many people got on his radar that he published a series of pieces culminating with a column in the New Statesman, which he frequently contributes to, the center-left British publication, calling for state action, in his words, against what he called the pro-Putin left. And he singled me and Aaron out in that piece.
And it was called "Empower the People to Win the War on Disinformation. The Left Should Champion State and Community Action to Challenge the Lies of Its Own Pro-Kremlin Fringe."
Yeah, so people power, in his view, we soon learned after we were able to view emails between Mason and several intelligence-linked figures or straight-up intelligence officials, that he was actually colluding with the British intelligence services, or attempting to collude, in order to launch first an investigation against the gray zone, as well as an anti-gray zone summit in London at the offices of an intelligence contractor called Valent Projects, which had run several information warfare operations in Syria, run by a character named Amil Khan, who we'd previously exposed at the Gray Zone astroturfing YouTube projects, and just being generally shady. They also invited Bellingcat, which Aaron has written and talked about a lot, is a US and UK state-funded, supposed open source journalistic collective, one of the most celebrated media organizations in the West. They wanted to invite them to this summit where they were going to supposedly plot the destruction of the gray zone, and all on the basis of Paul Mason's imaginary fantasy that we were actually hiding the fact that we were a Kremlin information warfare vehicle posing as a grassroots independent journalistic outfit, which, you know, really is a projection of what Paul Mason is doing. The irony here is also that Paul Mason was plotting to set up what he called an international information brigade, which would be a state-run propaganda organization pushing war in Ukraine and attacking, smearing, naming and shaming anyone opposed to that war within the UK left. And it would all be run with what he called a Russian dollar matryoshka approach, where, nested within a seemingly organic veneer was the committed group of individuals who are intelligence officers and journalists who are their assets, like himself.
Isn't it suspicious that he would use the Matryoshka doll as a comparison? That suggests close cultural ties or affinity with Russia.
Well, definitely, it suggests an emulation of what he imagines Russia to be doing.
Yeah.
And you see throughout these emails, he's using all of this John le Carré, Graham Greene spook language about needing to have clean phones and using white label organizations and encrypted emails. Even as he somehow bungled his way into getting exposed, he's kind of like a Walter Mitty type who has obviously imagines himself operating in some cloak and dagger clandestine fashion against the Russian disinformation war, and really has been embarrassed with one particular email where he provides, and I'll explain the figure that he's providing all this to in a second, but he provides to his intelligence source what he calls a mind map of the UK left.
So these emails show kind of a plot launched by Paul Mason, or an attempt from Paul Mason to organize a way to take down the gray zone. So I'm just going to read one of the more significant emails. He writes, "I'm keen to help re-gray zone. If you have any access to resources and expertise, here is what I suggest. A dynamic map of the left pro-Putin infosphere. I made one of the British left Putin influencers that I can share with you, but a more useful project would be to get pro-traffic analysts to map how the different echo chambers interact, where their material begins, and work out who might be pulling the strings. We could use the Jacques Bode article on Ukraine as an example of purposefully created disinfo."
I'm sure we can get it on screen now.
Yeah.
It's one of the most bonkers charts if you consider the implications of it. So you can see on the left of the chart, the Chinese and Russian state. So the official enemies in the great power competition in the new Cold War are naturally there. But as you move right, you start to see everyone that Paul Mason imagines as a Trojan horse, asset, or useful idiot of the Russian and Chinese state, until we start to arrive towards the center at figures within Jeremy Corbyn's immediate orbit, like Diane Abbott, a member of parliament, and then Corbyn himself is there. So this is someone that Paul Mason claimed to support and kind of represent within the media, is targeted as a key vehicle here of Russian and Chinese influence. And then you continue to move to the right until you arrive all the way on the right. You can see in white, the text there identifies key labor constituencies. In the upper right-hand corner, the Muslim community, then the young networked left, then the Black community, and then Scottish nationalism, so the whole Scottish nation. And this is Paul Mason's enemies list. So he's basically, what he's saying is that Russia and China are corrupting the Black and Muslim community, as well as, the young network left, which would basically be like your audience. And the left, therefore, needs to be neutralized through state action. I mean, the whole left, it's like everyone. Medea Benjamin's there, Code Pink, the Morning Star, which is Britain's oldest newspaper. It's a socialist newspaper funded by labor unions. That he wants them all taken out because of this war that he has to wage. So who is Paul Mason's contact? This is kind of a funny aspect of the piece.
I'm going to give you guys a cliffhanger. But if you'd like to watch the rest of this, it's on Useful Idiots, which is a show by Katie Halper and Matt Taibbi, who's on a book. He's writing a book, and Mate. Great show. It seems that the CIA and parts of the deep state have taken to heart the words of Nazi leader Hermann Göring at the Nuremberg trials, who remarked, "Of course people don't want war, but after all, it's the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy, a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament, or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked, and denounce the pacifists for their lack of patriotism, and exposing the country to greater danger. We've seen this strategy in the information war to persuade Americans that anything less than full support for a proxy war with Russia makes one part of the so-called pro-Putin left. So in conclusion, the CIA's role has been to grow an American synthetic left that is hopelessly misinformed about real socialism, thinks Stalin and Hitler were essentially allies, and who thinks imperialism is what Russia is doing in Ukraine or China is doing in Africa. A left that sides with the imperialists in calling for a regime change in Russia, China, and other anti-imperialist and socialist countries. They want a pro-NATO, pro-EU left that cheers for big tech censorship, susceptible to influencers and shills for pro-war Democrats who unanimously vote to give billions in military aid, no strings attached, to Nazis and weapon makers. A woke and censorious left that is off-putting to the masses. The CIA's role has been to facilitate laughingstocks like the 2019 DSA convention, with participants terrified of being canceled, agreeing to bizarre rituals and endless motions.
Point of privilege. I was there.
No clapping.
No clapping.
No clapping. Jazz hands, please. Thank you. And as Haas from Infrared has argued recently, there's almost a kind of synthetic right in the making. Neocon globalists like Ron DeSantis' anti-woke virtuous signaling suggests an effort on the right to steal Donald Trump's thunder and neutralize his populist movement, whether or not he's a real populist. This perpetual culture war undermines the class war we need to wage. I want to close with this quote from Julian Assange. Populations don't like wars. They have to be lied into it. That means we can be truthed into peace. This is a great cause for hope.
Free Assange!
Free Assange! Free Assange! Free Assange! Free Assange! Free Assange! Free Assange! Free Assange! Free Assange! Free Assange! Free Assange! Free Assange! Free Assange! I think the same can be said of capitalism and of socialism and communism. People don't like capitalism, and they have to be lied into it. That means working people can be truthed into socialism and communism. This is a great cause for hope. But it will not come without struggle. It won't be handed to us. It is more urgent than ever to learn from our international comrades and educate ourselves and others in the imperial core to find the real left. Thank you. And if I could make one shameless plug, I'm 7 subscribers away from 500 on YouTube. At which point I'll get the community features. So if you are interested, my channel on YouTube is called Parasocialite.